were developed. At the beginning of the fourth month, the latter forms a curved elevation continuous behind with the medial surface of the temporal lobe and consisting from before backwards of the gyrus olfactorius lateralis, gyrus ambiens, and gyrus semilunaris, parts which in the adult brain are represented by the lateral root of the olfactory tract and the uncus. The position and connections of the remaining portions of the rhinencephalon are described with the anatomy of the brain. The corpus striatum appears in the fourth week as a triangular thickening of the floor of the telencephalon between the optic recess and the interventricular foramen, and continues behind with the thalamic part of the diencephalon. It increases in size, and by the second month is seen as a swelling in the floor of the furtio lateral ventricle. This swelling reaches as far as the posterior end of the primitive hemisphere, and when this part of the hemisphere grows backward and downward to form the temporal lobe, the posterior part of the corpus striatum is carried into the roof of the inferior horn of the ventricle, where it is seen as a tail of the caudate nucleus in the adult brain. During the fourth and fifth month, the corpus striatum becomes incompletely subdivided by the fibers of the internal capsule into two masses, an inner, the caudate nucleus, and an outer, the lentiform nucleus. In front, the corpus striatum is continuous with the anterior perforated substance. Laterally, it is confluent for a time with that portion of the wall of the vesicle which is developed into the insula, but this continuity is subsequently interrupted by the fibers of the external capsule. The neopallium forms the remaining and by far the greater part of the cerebral hemisphere. It consists as an early stage of a relatively large, more or less hemispherical cavity, the primitive lateral ventricle, enclosed by a thin wall from which the cortex of the hemisphere is developed. The vesicle expands in all directions, but more especially upward and backward, so that by the third month, the hemispheres cover the diencephalon, by the sixth they overlap the midbrain, and by the eighth the hindbrain. The median lamina uniting the two hemispheres does not share in their expansion, and thus the hemispheres are separated by a deep cleft, the forerunner of the longitudinal fissure, and this cleft is occupied by a septum of mesodermal tissue which constitutes the primitive falx cerebri. Coincidentally with the expansion of the vesicle, its cavity is drawn out into three prolongations which represent the horn of the future lateral ventricle. The hinder end of the vesicle is carried downward and forward and forms the inferior horn. The posterior horn is produced somewhat later and associated with the backward growth of the occipital lobe of the hemisphere. The roof plate of the primitive forebrain remains thin and of an epithelial character. It is invaginated into the lateral ventricle along the median wall of the hemisphere. This invagination constitutes the choroidal fissure and extends from the interventricular foramen to the posterior end of the vesicle. Mesodermal tissue, continuous to that of the primitive falx cerebri and carrying blood vessels with it, spreads between the two layers of the invaginated fold and forms the rudiment of the tela choroidea. The margins of the tela become highly vascular and form the choroid plexuses, which for some months almost completely fill the ventricular cavities. The tela at the same time invaginates the epithelial roof of the diencephalon to form the choroid plexuses of the third ventricle. By the downward and forward growth of the posterior end of the vesicle to form the temporal lobe, the choroidal fissure finally reaches from the interventricular foramen to the extremity of the inferior horn of the ventricle. Parallel with, but above and in front of the choroidal fissure, the median wall of the cerebral vesicle becomes folded outward and gives rise to the hippocampal fissure on the median surface and to a corresponding elevation, the hippocampus within the ventricular cavity. The gray or ganglionic covering of the wall of the vesicle ends at the inferior margin of the fissure, is a thickened edge. Beneath this, the marginal reticular layer, future white substance, is exposed and its lower thinned edge is continuous with the epithelial invagination covering the choroid plexus. As a result of the later downward and forward growth of the temporal lobe, the hippocampal fissure and the parts associated with it extend from the interventricular foramen to the end of the inferior horn of the ventricle. The thickened edge of gray substance becomes the gyrus dentatus, the fasciola cinerea, and the supra and subcallosal gyri, while the free edge of the white substance forms the fimbria hippocampi and the body and crus of the fornix. The corpus callosum is developed within the arch of the hippocampal fissure, and the upper part of the fissure forms in the adult brain the callosal fissure on the medial surface of the hemisphere. The commissures. The development of the posterior commissure has already been referred to. The great commissures of the hemisphere, that is, the corpus callosum, the fornix, and the anterior commissures, arise from the lamina terminalis. About the 4th month, a small thickening appears in this lamina immediately in front of the interventricular foramen. The lower part of this thickening is soon constricted off, and fibers appear in it to form the anterior commissure. The upper part continues to grow with the hemispheres and is evaded by 2 sets of fibers. Transverse fibers, extending between the hemispheres, pass into its dorsal part, which is now differentiated as the corpus callosum. In rare cases, the corpus callosum is not developed. Into the ventral part, longitudinal fibers from the hippocampus pass to the lamina terminalis and through that structure to the corpora mammillaria. These fibers constitute the fornix. A small portion lying antero-inferiorly between the corpus callosum and the fornix is not invaded by the commissural fibers. It remains thin, and later a cavity, the cavity of the septum pellucidum, forms in its interior. Fissures and sulci. The outer surface of the cerebral hemispheres is at first smooth, but later it exhibits a number of elevations or convolutions, separated from each other by fissures and sulci, most of which make their appearance during the 6th or 7th month of fetal life. The term fissure is applied to such grooves as involve the entire thickness of the cerebral wall, and thus produce corresponding eminences in the ventricular cavity, while the sulci affect only the superficial part of the wall, and therefore leave no impression in the ventricle. The fissures comprise the choroidal and hippocampal already described, and 2 others, that is, the calcarine and collateral, which produce the swellings known respectively as the calcar avis and the collateral eminence in the ventricular cavity. Of the sulci, the following may be referred to, that is, the central sulcus, fissure of Rolando, which is developed in 2 parts, the intraparietal sulcus in 4 parts, and the cingulate sulcus in 2 or 3 parts. The lateral cerebral or sylvian fissures differs from all the other fissures in its mode of development. It appears about the 3rd month as a depression, the sylvian fossa, on the lateral surface of the hemisphere. This fossa corresponds with the position of the corpus striatum, and its floor is molded to form the insula. The intimate connection which exists between the cortex of the insula and the subjacent corpus striatum prevents this part of the hemisphere wall from expanding at the same rate as the portions which surround it. The neighboring parts of the hemisphere therefore gradually grow over and cover in the insula, and constitute the temporal, parietal, frontal, and orbital opercula of the adult brain. The frontal and orbital opercula are the last to form, but by the end of the 1st year after birth, the insula is completely submerged by the approximation of the opercula. The fissures separating the opposed margins of the opercula constitute the composite lateral cerebral fissure. If a section across the wall of the hemisphere about the 6th week be examined microscopically, it will be found to consist of a thin marginal or reticular layer, a thick ependymal layer, and a thin intervening mantle layer. Neuroblasts from the ependymal and mantle layers migrate into the deep part of the marginal layer and form the cells of the cerebral cortex. The nerve fibers, which form the underlying white substance of the hemispheres, consist at first of outgrowth from the cells of the corpora striata and the thalami. Later, the fibers from the cells of the cortex are added. Medullation of these fibers begins about the time of birth and is continuous until puberty. A summary of these parts, derived from the brain vesicles, is given in the following table. The hindbrain or rhombencephalon give rise to the myelencephalon, medencephalon, and isthmus rhombencephali. The myelencephalon gives rise to the medulla oblongata and lower part of the 4th ventricle, the medencephalon to the pons, cerebellum, and intermediate part of the 4th ventricle, and the isthmus rhombencephali, the anterior medullary velum, brachium conjunctiva cerebelli, and upper part of the 4th ventricle. The midbrain, or mesencephalon, gives rise to the cerebral peduncles, lamina quadrigemina, and cerebral aqueduct.